Maple syrup is so good. Who would have thought that something so simple, this delicious American food, would have its own story that tracks pretty closely to the story of America itself? Hi, I'm Pete Fenzel, and this is In Their Own Words, the story of the American experiment and the words of the people who made it happen. Now, nobody knows how long ago the first peoples discovered the sweetness of maple sap. And there are several different origin stories among the tribes, the most prominent of which is by the Iroquois, who had a chief called Woxus, who apparently threw his tomahawk into a tree trunk, and the sap came out and dripped into a basket that located at the foot of the tree. And Woxus' wife discovered that, and overnight the basket of sap froze, and they discarded the ice, which was almost 100% water. And the next day used that maple sap for cooking, and it turned out that everything was much sweeter, and they had a delicious dinner from that. There's another origin story of how tribesmen would take broken branches from maple trees and have sapsicles. They would just enjoy the frozen sap that was on the edge of the broken branches. They were dealing with maple water. They were not dealing with maple syrup. It took the American colonists with their copper and iron kettles and cauldrons to evaporate the sap down to maple syrup. And their objective was to make maple sugar, not syrup, because maple sugar in a block could be preserved over many, many months and could be transported easily, whereas syrup back in those days could not. But it was the widespread use of maple sugar in the new American Republic that paved the way for the maple syrup that we know and love today. A single family could make over 1,000 pounds of maple sugar back in colonial times and in the early days of our new republic. And they could easily supply themselves with the sugar that they needed, as well as having surplus sugar that they then could sell to provide another income stream for their families. Now, maple sugar made here in the United States was made by a free people, unlike cane sugar, which came from the British-owned sugar islands in the Caribbean and produced by slave labor. And there was a great preference in the early days of our republic, especially among people in the North, to consume maple sugar rather than slave sugar from our adversary, if not our outright enemy, Great Britain. Remember, we had just fought an 8-year horrible war of independence against Great Britain, and we didn't like them, and they certainly didn't like us. And so maple sugar from good American producers was what we were hoping for. Kind of like the sentiment that we have around America today, that we want to support American businesses, American manufacturers, and American workers by buying American instead of buying goods made overseas by slave labor or by oppressed people. Now, Thomas Jefferson was a particular advocate of developing a maple sugar industry in the United States because he understood that we had millions upon millions of sugar maple trees, and it was not too hard for farming families to produce great quantities of maple sugar because it was every bit as good as the granulated sugar that we know today. Jefferson, like many in his era, saw maple sugar as a potential commodity for export for the benefit of the American economy, like tobacco and lumber and corn, as well as a weapon to oppose the institution of slavery. For example, Jefferson wrote a letter to a colleague of his in London named Benjamin Vaughan in June of 1790, and he said, "Though large countries within our Union are covered with the sugar maple as heavily as can be conceived, and that this tree yields a sugar equal to the best from the cane, yields it in great quantity, with no other labor than what the women and girls can bestow, who attend to the drawing off and boiling the liquor, and this trees, when skillfully tapped, will have a great number of years. What a blessing to substitute a sugar which requires only the labor of children for that which is said renders the slavery of blacks necessary. Now, Jefferson's attempt to establish a domestic sugar industry and to oppose the continuation of the institution of slavery in America was frustrated by several different events. One was the invention of the cotton gin a couple of years later, which reinvigorated the institution of slavery in the country. Another factor was that maple sugar was made in small farms scattered all over the northern states, rather than in large plantations with immediate access to transportation to international markets. The third factor was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, where we acquired lands now suitable for cultivation of sugarcane. So sugarcane was grown in the United States and sugar produced by American slave labor. And finally, the population of the North in the United States was growing exponentially. And so large tracts of forest had to be cleared to make way for new farms. And we lost millions of maple trees in the course of clearing acreage for new farming. Throughout the 1800s, maple sugar lost ground to cane sugar. But in 1860, I think it was, the USDA reported that we produced 40 million pounds of maple sugar and 1.6 million gallons of maple syrup. American producers of maple sap were beginning to pivot away from sugar and pivot towards maple syrup. And this coincided with two great inventions. One was the metal evaporator in 1858, and the other was the invention of tin cans, because before then, maple syrup could not be packaged, preserved, and transported like blocks of maple sugar could have been. And so for the remainder of the 1800s and well through the 20th century, it was all about maple syrup instead of maple sugar. Now, the traditional methods of making maple syrup by going from tree to tree and emptying the buckets of the sap persisted well into the post-war years here in the United States. But it wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that new innovations and new inventions took hold. And so here we are in the Adirondack Mountains, and let's go visit a few maple syrup producers and see how it's done. We're here at Hidden Hollow Maple Farm up in the Adirondacks with Charlie Wallace, the proprietor, who's going to run us through how maple syrup is made from tree sap. Take it away, Charlie.
Well, you start off by drilling a hole in a maple tree and either hang a bucket on it or put it in a spout and put the in there. From there it has to go to a collections station and then to the sugar house, where you then evaporate it down and turn it into maple syrup, which is what we're doing here in this evaporator. This is a 3x12 wood-fired evaporator, additional arch. We do use reverse osmosis, but the arch is a traditional wood-fired arch. We make about 1,000 gallons of syrup a year, and essentially we do use reverse osmosis, but for the most part we do evaporate down here.
That's great. Charlie, can you show us your firebox in there with the wood fire? Yep. Now you call this thing an arch. What does that mean?
Arch is what they call an evaporator, a firebox of the evaporator.
Alrighty.
That was the name we gave them. The entire unit of the evaporator, the arch is just where the wood is, the firebox.
Now bring this up. This is what's evaporating, right? This is all the tree sap evaporating.
Correct.
And you got a whole bunch of different compartments in here. What do they do?
Correct. As you evaporate water out of the sap, it becomes heavier, and that actually moves through these compartments to where you actually stop it with a thermometer and a valve, and you can draw syrup at that location.
So how many gallons of tree sap does it take to make a gallon of your maple syrup?
Assuming based on 2% sap, about 45.
Wow. All righty. And then when that's all done, we got over here to your retail outlet. And we make, and this is where it all comes to an end, right?
Well, yeah, we have to filter it once it's done. And then from there, we'll take and bottle it as needed and grade it. And it's ready for tea set.
Great. Thanks so much, Charlie. Appreciate it. We're here at Mud Street Maple in Thurman, New York.
Yep.
The capital of maple sugar making
Yep.
and maple syrup making in the entire world.
Yep. There's probably 5 or 6 of us in Thurman.
I've got Jeff Mailer here with me. He's the proprietor here of the Mud Street Maple. And behind us are a whole bunch of blue tubes. Could you tell us about those, please, Jeff?
The blue and black tubes are our main line that brings the sap to the pump house into the sugar house.
So where do they come from?
They come from way back, probably 2,000 feet back.
And is it you take a tap and you tap a small hole into the tree?
Yep, we drill a small hole into the tree and we put our spout in the tree, and the lateral line brings it down to the main line. And from the main lines it comes into the pump house.
And so these are all the main lines that are heading into the pump house, right?
Yep.
Now what happens when they get to the pump house?
We pump over to our big tank, and then from our big tank we pump it through the reverse osmosis machine, and then we pump it up to our head tank and stuff, and then that's when we boil it off.
And that goes into the
And that goes into
evaporator.
the evaporator, that's correct.
And thanks so much. How's the year going so far?
It's going great. It's been a good year.
Excellent.
Took a little bit to get going, but it's going and we're doing great.
Thank you so much. I appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
So here we are in Thurman, New York. Since we're only about an hour and more from here to the Canadian border, it's only appropriate that we should give a remark about our neighbors up north. Canada has always had the maple leaf as its symbol from the very beginning of the country. Indeed, the flag of Canada shows a red maple leaf on a white field. Now, with a very tiny population, Canada never had to destroy its forests of sugar maples in order to make way for new farming. And so today, as a result, Canada provides the majority of maple syrup to the global markets for the product. And so today we give a tip of the hat to our dear neighbors to the north for their love of maple syrup as well. We're here up in the Adirondack Mountains in Thurman, New York with Randy Galusha. Oh, wait a second. Oh, there you are, Randy. Come on in here. Randy's the proprietor of Toad Hill Maple Farm, a fine establishment, and Randy's going to tell us all how we get maple sap from the tree to become maple syrup on our pancakes. So why don't you tell us about that, Randy?
Well, if you want to step back here, I'll walk you through the process.
Okie doke.
So welcome to Toad Hill Maple Farm. I'm Randy, and this is a demonstration of how we get the sap from a maple tree, and ultimately we'll show you how we turn it into maple syrup. Historically, we gathered sap with buckets. We used to drill a hole in the tree, sap would drip out into the bucket, and then we would carry that sap back to the sugar house where we would boil it and turn it into syrup. Sometime in the 70s, the maple industry adopted maple tubing, and that's how we currently gather all of our sap from the trees. The way the process works, our season starts sometime usually in February or early March. We walk to every tree and drill a hole into the tree, and then we insert what's called a spout, a tap, or a spile. Different names, actually all the same thing. That spout gets tapped into the tree, and that allows the sap to drip out of the tree, run down through the tubing to our pump station where it gets pumped up to our sugar house. The sap is very thin, it's just like water. It's on average about 2% sugar, and at that concentration, it takes about 40 gallons of sap to make a gallon of syrup. So also, our tubing system is quite extensive in the woods. At our farm, we have 3,200 maple trees connected together with 15 miles of tubing that all flow into about 5 miles of large mainline pipes suspended on wire. That whole network of piping is sloped so it runs down to the pump station where the sap ends up going in and then getting pumped to the sugar house. Also on our tubing system, we have a vacuum pump. There are days when the sap does not flow well, so the vacuum pump actually draws vacuum back through the tubing system and helps us get some sap flow on those days when the sap isn't flowing well. But what makes sap flow well? That's what Mother Nature does that's very unique with a maple tree and the cell structure in a maple tree. She actually freezes the tree, the gases inside the cell structure in the tree, and that freezing compresses the gases and creates pressure. And so the next day after the tree thaws out, that pressure is what pushes the sap out. It's just on some days the sap doesn't flow so well. That's why we use the vacuum pump. Does no harm to the tree or damage, just helps us get a little bit more sap. And the amount of sap that we take from the tree is a small percentage of what the tree produces. You can think of it as donating blood. When you donate a little bit of blood, your body replenishes it, same with the tree.
Good. So where does the sap go after you've brought it down to the pump room and to the tanks?
So it flows into our tanks, and then from our storage tanks, it then flows through our reverse osmosis machine. What happens is as the sap passes through the RO machine, the sugar and the water are separated, and the RO removes about 85 to 90% of the water, and the remaining 10 to 15% has all the sugar in it. We call that the concentrate, and the concentrate goes into a small tank that then feeds into the evaporator.
Okay, let's take a look at your evaporator if we could.
Sure thing. So the evaporator here at our farm is wood-fired. It's actually a pretty advanced wood-fired evaporator. It's very efficient. It has blowers on it to create a much hotter fire. We frequently run stack temperatures between 1,000 and 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. This is where we actually boil the concentrate and turn it into syrup. You need to boil the concentrate or the sugars in order to caramelize them, and that's what gives maple its color and also its very well-known maple flavor. So that caramelization is a very, very important step in the process.
Okay, fantastic. Now let's go take a look at the finished product if we could.
So these are some samples of some of the syrup that we made. You can see variations in the color. The lighter colored syrups are what we call golden delicate. It has a golden color and a delicate maple flavor. As you progress through to the darker ones, the next one is called amber rich, amber color, rich flavor. The darker ones would be considered dark robust, so dark color with a robust maple flavor. There is one more grade which doesn't appear here, which is very dark strong. That's usually something that's made at the tail end of the season. So there's a common perception that lighter syrups are thinner and darker syrups are thicker. That's not actually true. They're all the same density and the same sugar concentration.
Okay, thanks very much, Randy.
You're welcome.
We have now moved from the land of the sugar maple to the land of the diner, where we have assembled a crack panel of the most eminent maple syrupologists available. We are here to get their take on the Epicurean virtues of pure maple syrup. So what do you say, fellas?
Right.
Yeah? Well, there you have it, folks. A unanimous testimonial. This may be the end of our episode, but the story of maple syrup continues in your home, at your breakfast table. Thanks so much for watching. God bless you.